Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. You know, I expect that call and response. So, my name is Congresswoman Karen Bass. I want to welcome you to our third Africa Policy Breakfast. This is a series of events that we've been having to talk about issues that are critical to the continent and critical to U.S.-Africa relationships. And what has been front and center on our agenda this year is AGOA. And, you know, if we think about it, it was just almost a year ago to the day that we had fought long and hard for the extension of the third country fabric so that we could get that part of AGOA extended. And boy, we almost got to the last minute, didn't we, Ambassador Soberon? But we did it, and because of that battle, we're trying not to repeat that. And AGOA expires in the next couple of years, and we wanted to get started early so that we don't wind up in the same situation. So as we begin this breakfast this morning, we know that the President has recently been to the continent, and we're going to hear a report from Grant Harris, who was on that trip. But also, there were several initiatives that were announced during the week that he was there, which we will learn more about. And then in just over a week, the Africa Women's Entrepreneurship Forum, followed by the AGOA Forum, will take place in Addis. And so, in anticipation of the AGOA Forum and also following up on the President's trip, that characterizes the breakfast that we will have this morning in our discussion. And before we begin, I want to bring up the most honorable, the most notable Congressman Charlie Rangel.
I'm so excited once again that God has given the Congress Karen Bass, and Africa should be proud too. It's amazing to me that after all these years I've been in the Congress, that trade and African trade appears to be the only bipartisan issue, that we will be able to take up. And a lot of that has to do with the Democrat-Republican leadership, of which Karen Bass has been excitingly helpful in making certain that both bodies work together. I'm always amazed when I hear international pundits express the fact that Africa is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. But they never get into the reason why it's one of the last areas that's being developed in the world. And the thoughts behind what has happened to Africa still remains all over the world and still remains in the United States of America. And so once we're going to be judged by the character that we have rather than the color of our skins, more trade, more money, more resources makes people more colorblind than anything that I've been able to see in my 83 years. And so this is a courageous economic trade issue that we're discussing. But in my humble opinion, it's going to have more views of how people look at beautiful people of color than anything that I have seen in my lifetime. So you're doing God's work, and thank you again, Karen.
You know, we're so lucky to have Mr. Rangel in Congress as someone who was responsible for AGOA's beginning several years ago and there to provide guidance and support to us while we embark on the reauthorization of AGOA. So thank you very much, Mr. Rangel. We're also happy to be joined by David Cicilline, who is my colleague in Congress. We started in Congress together in our second term. David is from Rhode Island, and he sits on the Africa Subcommittee, so I wanted to acknowledge and welcome him for being here. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator. Scott Eisner is the Vice President of African Affairs and International Operations at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He represents the Chamber's interest in sub-Saharan Africa through its Africa Business Initiative, the business community's leading advocacy group aimed at strengthening U.S.-Africa trade relations. Welcome.
Well, thank you, everyone. This is a great turnout for a Thursday afternoon for an Africa event in a week that's usually the week where no one wants to be around because they're getting ready for summer. But I want to thank Representative Bass for your leadership on today's forum and the ongoing series you presented. I think this is the third of which policy breakfasts you've had. And it's an important one because it brings together a lot of like-minded and disparate groups who can all think together at one point in time about the future of Africa. And Representative Rangel and others, we appreciate your leadership over the past decades, if I'll say, on Africa-related issues from the Chamber of Commerce. I know Tom Donahue has always appreciated your leadership on a number of issues, so thank you. As the representative said, I'm Scott Eisner, Vice President for African Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Today is, as I said, an important event. We have a distinguished panel of thinkers today around the Africa policy spectrum, from government representatives on the U.S. and African side to corporate representatives. We think that today's panel discussion will really be a good prelude as we lead into the AGOA Forum, which is, I guess, just 2 weeks away, but also to recap and capture the ideas and thoughts that came with the President's recent trip to 3 African countries, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania, where he announced the Power Africa initiative, as well as Africa Trade, or Trade Africa. At one point during this session this morning, we will have Ambassador Soberin come up and talk to us a little bit about the Africa Diplomatic Corps' AGOA thinking and where it's going for their future, their recommendations. A little bit on the formalities of today. We'll start at the far right side with Grant Harris and work our way down. Each of you should have a short bio of your seats of each of the panelists. I'll refrain from reading them. If you don't know who they are, then I question why you might be in the room, because I think they're all very distinguished in their own way. So with that, I think we need to think a little bit about where we're going with today's conversation. Obviously, it'll be open up to the panel for responding to questions from the audience at the end of their presentations as well. But this is important because it comes on the heels of the President's very successful trip to Africa, one which I know us in the business community long awaited for, and many others did, and we applaud thinking and leadership that went into it from Grant and others, Flory, that really put a lot of effort into making sure the President's trip was well met and well received. It doesn't come without competition from around the world. Just as a couple weeks prior to the President's trip, we saw the President of China there, and we see presidents constantly going through with business delegations and others. So the more we see from our government going there, I know announced was Commerce Secretary Pritzker will be taking a trade delegation to Africa in the spring of next year, which we can't wait for. I'm sure Mr. Froman, Ambassador Froman, will be quite active in the Africa space, so good luck, Flory. It should be an interesting couple of years. But the great thing about this is exactly what Representative Rangel said. We're no longer looking at Africa as an aid or a conflict area. This is it still occurs. We can't overlook that. There's still atrocities that happen throughout the world. But really where Africa is going now as a continent, as a community, is towards this economic investment. No longer is it just the Chinese are the big investors in Africa. It's Africans that are the biggest investors in Africa. I believe by a factor, the South Africans actually invest more across the continent than anyone else in the world. So it's not that they're looking for aid from abroad or investment from abroad necessarily any longer. They're looking at each other as how they can be greater trading partners, and I'm sure Nigeria also plays a leading role in this equation. So we lead up to this. We've got the AGOA Forum coming in just a couple weeks with recommendations coming this fall at the Chamber. We're looking at AGOA as something that needs to be handled quickly. As the representative pointed out, last year the third country fabric went down to the wire. It barely passed on time, which caused a lot of constraints for folks from Lesotho to Mauritius to elsewhere in the world, on the continent, because we didn't act quickly enough. The business community, Congress, others did not act quickly enough to think about what the ramifications were of the AGOA timeframe. And we want to see a quick and swift reauthorization, but not without thinking through what is AGOA 2.0, or what does the next generation of AGOA look like. And I think that's where the panel is going to look at today. No longer can we look at it as just a beneficiation. Beneficiation is a word I picked up in Botswana not too long ago. Not quite sure what it means yet, but I'm working my way through it. But how can U.S. companies really benefit from the AGOA framework? Obviously, the African nations have figured out a couple ways. We need to expand possibly the list. We need to think of ways we can incentivize more in trade and investment, because let's be honest, at the end of the day, the greater exports from Africa means the higher GDP, means comes peace, prosperity, which also means a demand on U.S. goods and services that are really wanted across the continent. I don't think anyone will think that the way that the U.S. businesses go about investing is a bad one. In fact, the products from Microsoft and other ones are the ones that are sought after. It's no longer They want the cheap product. They want the one that's going to last and last forever. So with that, I think it's time to stop listening to me drone on about things that you guys already know about, and I want to turn over to Grant to give us a nice overview of the president's trip and the future thinking for the next 3.5, 4 years of where the White House and the administration will see Africa playing a prominent role. Grant?
Great. Scott, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Representative Bass and other members who came as well, and everyone for coming out to have this conversation. I wanted to briefly give an overview of the trip, which I think everyone is quite familiar with, but I wanted to touch on the major themes as we saw them and preview a little bit of the follow-up work that we'll be doing. I know my colleague Flory will be speaking in particular about AGOA and the upcoming forum. The trip is, as many are aware, highlighted 3 key themes. The first was starting a major push on trade and investment in Africa. The second was deepening our investments in democratic institutions. And the third was deepening our work in expanding it with respect to the next generation of young African leaders. Through each of these, we tried to make sure that the president was meeting with civil society, was meeting not just with heads of state, not just with those in the executive branch, but also with members of businesses. And throughout in each stop, we tried very hard to get at each of these themes. And I wanted to talk about, though, a little bit of what he was announcing and what the theory of the case was as to how we see our relationship with Africa and why we think right now trade and investment in particular is so important. Everyone's aware of the statistics, and as Scott alluded to, as previous speakers alluded to, the explosive economic growth that we're witnessing. But what we're hearing right now is a clamoring for American investment and also for American leadership in trying to be a strong partner for creating the type of economic governance and the investment climate that can really take this economic growth to the next level, while also ensuring that it's broad-based and that it benefits the many and not just the few. And so the design of the initiatives that the president announced, particularly in the economic space, is meant to get exactly at that. The first one is Power Africa. And that initiative is based to try to address one of the key constraints to economic growth, and that's the lack of electricity, the lack of power, the lack of not having a light to read by at night, not having a refrigerator that can store medicines, not having the types of inputs that you would need for a business to be reliable and to be able to be as productive as possible. The initiative that the president announced is aimed to try to double power in sub-Saharan Africa. And it tries to leverage an initial investment of $7 billion on the US side, but that's not where the bulk of the money is going to come from. That's not the theory of the case. The theory is garnering, taking bankable deals, trying to figure out what we need to do to actually bring them up and how we can get others to invest it. It's also focused in trying to leverage across our government the resources of OPIC and EXIM and other agencies to make sure that it truly is a whole of government approach. The idea there, with that $7 billion already being matched by $9 billion in private investments, and even since then it's grown significantly as the interest of the trip has caused others to reach out and other companies looking to make major investments as well. And we'll be talking more about that in the coming days. This is a critical need. As I mentioned, more than 2/3 of sub-Saharan Africa are without power, and so it's an idea that I think really struck a chord and was very favorably and positively received by all with whom we spoke during the trip. Another aspect in that space that Scott also mentioned is Trade Africa. We've been doing quite a bit of work, including with the East African community and others, to try to make sure that we as a partner are doing what we can to break down barriers to trade, particularly intra-regional trade, as that's something that can be exponentially grown and will have a huge benefit. Through the East African community, we're trying to actually increase EAC exports to the United States by 40% and to have very specific goals so that we can look back and see tangibly what we've done and how it's worked. We want to build this out as well. It starts in the EAC because there's a lot of excitement and a lot of reforms underway, but this is something that can be grown to scale and also used to cooperate with other regional economic organizations. Aside from the specific Trade and Power Africa initiatives, the president also unveiled an expansion of the Young African Leaders Initiative, which is something that's very important to how we engage with the continent. Given the numbers that many have seen, over 60% of the continent is under the age of 35. It's incredibly young, and these young people need opportunities, and they need to have the skills both to lead, but also to be able to start and grow their businesses. And so the idea of the Young African Leaders Initiative is to help provide those leadership training opportunities and to help foster networks among young leaders with each other and also with Americans as well. And in expanding this program, the President announced the Washington Fellowship. So these Washington Fellows will come to the United States. It'll start with 500 a year. It will be grown to 1,000 a year, and they will have executive leadership training in various universities across the country. They'll be trained in civic management, in entrepreneurship. They'll be trained in advocacy. So they'll be trained in many different fields, and then we'll try to work with not just our embassies, but our government partners, our regional economic organization partners, businesses, to create opportunities in Africa that are meaningful, that create a pipeline for them to put these skills to practical use. The idea being that all of our work for strengthening democratic institutions or promoting broad-based economic prosperity is going to depend on this generation having the skills and the ability and the opportunities to get involved and to lead. We had some other initiatives as well that I just wanted to briefly touch on, though not the focus of today's conversation. We've increased our activity in trying to combat wildlife trafficking, which is a serious economic issue for some of our African partners in particular. And so the President announced and signed an executive order during his trip, which will lead to a more developed strategy on the U.S. part, but was also combined with additional $10 million in technical assistance to partners there. The President also highlighted some of the ongoing initiatives, particularly in health and in food security, and there's an angle there that I think is also incredibly important, even as we think about trade and the economic space, and that's how we've been going about issues like food security. Through the New Alliance and through our other initiatives in that space, there's been a complete focus on trying to get private sector involvement and trying to make sure that U.S. companies are a part of it, but also that are seeing these opportunities. So I mention that because the way we're doing business, it's not the assistance model, it's more of a trade model. It's an assistance and a trade and an investment model. He announced a few other things as well, but one in particular will give us a vehicle to follow up very concretely on the trade and investment work, and that's saying that the President is going to be hosting a Heads of State Summit here in Washington in 2014. And so that's something that we're very excited about. It'll be the first summit of its kind with the U.S. Head of State and Sub-Saharan African Heads of State here, able to talk about the trade and investment issues and able to talk about our work on democracy, health, food security, and everything across the board that we're doing with Sub-Saharan African partners. So that in a nutshell is the trip. But I think the bottom line and what AGOA fits into is that the President saw this as beginning a major push on trade and investment, in particular for the remainder of the administration. It's something that is critical at this moment in time, and it's something that's central to how we're trying to do things in these relationships. He mentioned as well stepped up commerce missions. He mentioned as well that his Treasury Secretary will be traveling around. He committed as well to his Energy Secretary traveling. So you can see that across our agencies, not just from the White House, that I think you'll see all the more of an elevated push in this space. So it's something that I think was very well received. I know we'll get more into AGOA today and how the forum is a key part of that in the next few years.
Thank you very much, Grant. That was a terrific overview. I couldn't applaud your efforts on poaching. It's something that gets overlooked quite a bit around the world, but the destabilizing factor that has on rule of law and other things on the continent really dissuades foreign direct investment from places like the U.S. So anything we can do in the business community to help support that, we'd be happy to. I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the arrival of two our ambassadors, and apologize to the ambassador from Mauritius for not acknowledging him first, but we have three ambassadors from Zambia, Cameroon, and Mauritius joining us as well today. So thank you all for coming. I'd next like to turn to Flore Lazare. Flore is the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Africa. She is a steady hand when it comes to Africa trade policy and has been a key partner to the business community in our thinking through how we can get through some of these trade barriers. So Flore.
So good morning, everyone, and let me just first say thank you so much to Congressman Rangel. He is someone who provided the seed and birth of AGOA some 13 years ago. And let me now also thank Congresswoman Bass and other members of Congress who are taking over in the teen years. And as you all know, many of you who have had teenagers, that those are some tough years. So we thank you for the initial birthing of AGOA, and for those of you in Congress who are now making sure that this teen gets to adulthood and that AGOA realizes its full potential as an adult. It's a perfect time for us to come together to talk about AGOA, where we've been with it, and where we need to go in the future. And we welcome the views of all the AGOA stakeholders. Our African counterparts, the ambassadors, have been doing an excellent job here in Washington, including last year, all the work that you all did to help extend the third country fabric provision of AGOA, and all the work you're doing now, including your report that came out yesterday with your recommendations on where we go in the future. But we also know that civil society has played a critical role. We know that the private sector, both in the U.S. and in Africa, play a critical role. And we remind people all the time that trade agreements of any sort are just the framework. It's the door that may open for more trade. But without the work of the private sector, nothing comes through the door. So one of the things that we want to focus on now is how we can help AGOA to push through that market access door, the U.S. being one of the largest single economies in the world, and lots of opportunities for their products here. How can we help them to do that? Grant's already mentioned that this is a great time because it comes shortly after the president's trip to the continent where trade and investment was highlighted, but it also comes right before now the AGOA Forum. Many of us here and around town are on our way to Ethiopia, and we welcome those members of Congress who are going to be joining us there. You know, AGOA has been, since it was birthed, AGOA has been the centerpiece of our economic engagement with Africa. And we think that it has been successful. I know that there's often a lot of debate about this, but for the products that were added to GSP, there were 4,600 products that were available for duty-free access into the U.S. market under our generalized system of preferences back when AGOA was established. What AGOA did, though, was to add 1,800 products on top of that, which really covered core manufacturing products. They were value-added products such as processed fish, apparel, textiles, footwear, and many others. Value-added agricultural products, as I said, was key. And our goal was to help the Africans have a competitive edge in the U.S. market. We think that